Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Dericki. I'm a professor here at Regis. I do have a PhD, so folks call me Dr. Dericki, some of them call me Dr. D. Some folks that work with me call me Brian. I'm not really into the whole naming thing, but most folks do call me Dr. D, and I'm okay with that. I am a social psychologist, and my teaching style is a little different than what you're used to, so I'm going to ask you to adapt to that a little bit. My purpose of today's lecture is not about presenting information for you to learn. I don't believe that that's the most effective form of education. So just get used to that. What my goal is I want to introduce you to something I love, my field, social psychology, and I want to introduce it to you in a way that you'll start to love it and appreciate it, particularly in ways you can improve your life. So my lecture has 5 mini lessons. The first mini lesson is a scope and history of social psychology lesson. It's just like a tiny little introduction to some of the big events and ideas in my field. The second part of the lecture is how do you improve your happiness? Just a little bit. I don't cover everything, just a little bit for each topic. The next part is why I assume you're in college to improve your performance and your potential and your skills. Additionally, for me, at least when I was an undergrad, it was kind of lonely from time to time, especially starting out. So I created a section on how to make friends and develop relationships and even how to fall in love a little bit. And finally, I'm an expert in the research of prejudice, so I'm going to present some information about how you combat your own biases and prejudices. So let's start. Now, what is social psychology to a social psychologist? This is a brilliant question because most of us love our field. We think it's the bee's knees, to use 1950s slang, but it's really interesting understanding how society works, understanding how society impacts us, understanding how to develop situations that help people reach their potential. Social psychology to me is an area of psychology that has immense potential. We're trying to develop interventions and a society that works for all of us. So to me, social psychology is really important and something I love. Now, whenever I go to a party and I tell somebody I'm a psychologist, they ask if I'm analyzing them, and I'm like, no, I don't. I'm not that kind of psychologist. And in fact, most of us aren't. Most of us are just everyday psychologists. We study people that aren't in trauma, that are, experiencing, daily life as we experience it. So, it's kind of it's part of that field of psychology. It's like, oh, how do people process information? How do people interact with others? How do people, learn things? All, everyday psychology, the stuff that our mind does every day, not only when in trauma, but when just thinking and, things like that. In general, my field focuses on what's called social influence. You've probably read this. This is basic example is peer pressure. One person, they have pressure on you and it impacts your thoughts and behaviors. Related is family pressure, right? Family's a little bit more intense than our peers, and there's a little bit more connection there, but family pressures. Another example is cultural pressures, the pressures in your society, the norms in your society, how you should behave. And also, interestingly, over the years, social psychology has been focused on self-pressure, like how you put pressure on yourself, how you motivate yourself, those sort of questions. Now, that's the basic textbook definition, but social psychology to me is a field of psychology with hope. We study problems like prejudice and racism and sexism with the hope that we can develop the interventions that will make them go away. And we also hope that we can create motivation, create the best environment, help people thrive and reach their full potential. As a social psychologist, I believe that we will one day crack the biggest mysteries of our field and be able to create a world where everyone is happy, healthy, productive. And that's the dream. And that is really the dream of my field, and it's where these things connect. Because if you think about social influence, you're going to see some of my examples have nothing to do with social influence, right? So it's like, well, what is social psychology then if it's not just social influence? It's a field of hope. And ultimately, I am a big nerd, and I've loved science since I was a little guy, and we use the scientific method and we use true experiments. That's what we're best known for. Not everything's a true experiment, but it's what we're best known for. So that's a little overview of the field. Let's get into some history. The first social psychology experiment was really just about peer pressure. Norman Triplett in 1898 in Bloomington, Indiana. I'm from Indiana, so I'm going to recognize something like that. But there's a lot of cyclists in Indiana. It's a big cycling culture. It has been for a very long time. And Norman Triplett took cyclists and had them ride by themselves or ride in a competition against someone else. And they gave them the same instructions. Look, we're testing how good you are. Like, we're going to see if you should make this team, whatever it was, right? And what they found was that when folks were riding against someone else, they rode much faster than when they rode by themselves. This is the first social psychology experiment, and and right now it's like no big deal, right? You're like, oh yeah, definitely I'm gonna do something harder if I compete, but we had no data on it, so this simple study does represent the social influence aspect of social psychology. Now, one of my favorite studies, which I've recently read, they didn't really do data analysis on it. They didn't have that knowledge back then, but still the effect is interesting. It's called the Hawthorne Effect. Now, the Hawthorne electrical plant, I'm fairly certain, I think it was in Chicago, it was somewhere in the Midwest, but essentially the management just wanted to figure out how to make the most effective factory. They were like, we could use science to develop the most effective factory. But what they found was the Hawthorne effect, which you'll understand in a moment. But they were applying scientific principles to the question of how to get their workers to produce more light bulbs. So they added more lights in the factory, and they wanted to see how many light bulbs or widgets that the folks produced. So they added more lights in the factory. The widgets they were producing were light bulbs. So if that's confusing, I apologize. But what they found was that before they changed the lights, folks produced less light bulbs than after they changed the lights. And they're like, oh, so increasing light in the factory increases work productivity. Okay, let's just test if taking away lights reduces productivity as well. So they ran a second study. The management, they took away the lights that they added and then some, and then they looked at how quickly that the workers produced the widgets, in this case the light bulbs. What did they find? They found that when they took away the lights, the workers also produced more light bulbs. So you're like, wait, if they add lights or if they take away lights, the workers are producing more because the workers know they're being observed. When the workers know they're being observed, they work harder, they know they're being evaluated, and they work harder. It's called the Hawthorne Effect. And it's also probably something that all parents know, is that if they leave the room and they're not paying attention to the kids are not on their best behavior. So I think it's very similar. But this is another early social psychological finding that was important. It's like, okay, when people know they're being watched, they change their behavior. Now, the most famous study, I would say, in social psychology is the Milgram shock experiment. You've probably heard about it. Why I'm including it in this lecture is because it is the example that we look up to, not for ethics, but for modeling real-world problems in controlled laboratory settings. So you've got to understand how the world was in the 60s. It's not that far removed from World War II and the Holocaust, the 6 million Jewish people who died in Europe in the Holocaust really made people question their meaning, their purpose, and it really shaked up most people who were alive during that time. Like, the very idea that humanity could be that evil, that callous, that destructive, that murderous was a question that bothered people. And it bothered Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram wanted to know, like, what caused this? Do we need to be worried about this in our country? And ultimately, the big ideas of the time were that Germans were fascist. That's literally the hypothesis that existed before Milgram. The idea was that the Holocaust happened because Germans were bad people. And Milgram kind of questioned this, and as a social psychologist was, well, this situation was quite powerful. Can we show, does it suggest, can we show that people are motivated to obey an authority, to do horrible, despicable acts? So Milgram set up an analogy of, World War II Germany and Nazi Germany, and wanted to really take this complex situation and see if do people obey authority, will people just obey authority that aren't German and to the point of killing someone. That was the research question that was being addressed, and you can see where the ethics are starting to come in. But essentially, you had an experimenter, which they often presented themselves in a very prestigious manner, white lab coat, so forth. The experimenter simply told the participant that, look, your job as the teacher is to shock the learner when they get an answer wrong. The learner never really got an answer right, so the participant consistently had to shock the learner, who was a fake participant. And the experimenter's job is just to tell them the experiment must continue and so forth. So, you had people, every single trial, even you have labels on there like extreme shock, dangerous, warning. These words are stated on the shock panel. The shock panel's right there. Participants kept going and kept going and kept going. In fact, nobody stopped until this point in time. Now, this point in time is when the participant has a heart attack, a fake heart attack, but it was still presented as a heart attack. Oh, my heart, I can't continue. Very much in pain. And then participants were given a chance to shock at that point. Some participants dropped out. Some participants, then they had 10 more chances to keep going. Some participants dropped out, but after the heart attack and between the end. But most participants went completely through the end, shocking an unresponsive learner. The learner quit responding, shocking an unresponsive learner simply because somebody in a white lab coat told them to. Now, this is important, and I'm going to present the data in a second. But from the perspective of our methods, it's a really good example of how to take a real-world situation and model it in the laboratory. And also, clearly, the findings are important. So one thing that I've noticed is that most folks have never read the Milgram report. So I'm going to read a section from you in the results that'll kind of show you how intense and how unethical the behavior the researchers were in this case. I'm not saying they weren't unethical, but here's what Stanley Milgram wrote about his results. Many subjects showed signs of nervousness in the experimental situation, and especially upon administering the more powerful shocks. In a large number of cases, the degree of tension reached extremes that are rarely seen in social psychological laboratory studies. Subjects were observed to sweat, tremble, stumble, bite their lips, groan, and dig their fingernails into their flesh. Don't forget that, okay? Nobody talks about how difficult it was for these participants to make these decisions. These were characteristic rather than exceptional responses to the experiment. One sign of tension was the regular occurrence of nervous laughing fits. 14 of the 40 subjects showed definite signs of nervous laughter and smiling. The laughter seemed entirely out of place, even bizarre. Full-blown, uncontrollable seizures were observed for 3 subjects. On one occasion, we observed a seizure so violently convulsive that it was necessary to call a halt to the experiment. Wow. You should have stopped it when you saw the nervous laughter. The subject, a 46-year-old encyclopedia salesman, was seriously embarrassed by his untoward and uncontrollable behavior. In the post-experimental interviews, subjects took pains to point out that they were not sadistic types and that the laughter did not mean they enjoyed shocking the victim. So no one stopped before the heart attack. 5 stopped immediately after the heart attack. 5 were like, I'm out. Right? 11%. Now, between the heart attack and the end, 16 people stopped shocking after the heart attack, but stopped sometime before the participant stopped responding. Right? So that was after the heart attack, they stopped responding, but that's basically the next 10 trials between the end. And 26 people continued to the very end, shocking a dead man multiple times until... just because somebody told them to. Milgram's work not only shows how to model a laboratory experiment, it shows us something about human nature. Humans do follow authority in society to even do horrible things, and the analogies that the Holocaust could happen in America as well. You've probably heard about the Stanford prison study. I have a link up here. It's not to any video or anything like that, but I want you to know that we've recently uncovered audio recordings of the Stanford prison study that show that it was faked. The main conclusion of the Stanford prison study was that people will take the role of that's given to them. So prison guards will act like the stereotypical prison guard and be mean to prisoners. Now the problem with that is that the audio tapes clearly show the researchers telling the participants that are assigned to the guard condition to be violent and aggressive against the prisoners. So this Stanford prison study was also another good example of how to model the real world in a laboratory setting. Also unethical. However, I want you to know it's the most famous but faked social psychology study, and this is really not up for debate anymore. Then we have the unsung theorist who, if you follow Kurt Levine, you will be one of the best thinking psychologists that you could possibly be. Now, Levine's ideas are presented as behavior as a function of person and environment, but that's not true. It's a whole book, and it's called field theory. Now, Levine's idea is that for any problem, we need to completely dissect the field, the behavior. Let's say a classroom, right? If you want to understand classroom behavior, you got to completely dissect the classroom. That means you got to understand why students are achieving. Well, why do they achieve? You got instruction, you got effort, you got stuff outside of school, you got lighting in the school, you got, how many peers are there, how much one-on-one time, right? And the list can keep going on and going on. But with a field theory idea, you list out every possible factor that can influence the behavior. And you start doing experiments that help you develop an equation that we can use to understand human behavior, with the ultimate goal to find those universal equations that completely predict human behavior across numerous situations. If you think about that, this is the goal of psychology, to develop an equation to predict all of human behavior. And this is our social psychological theorist about how to start putting together a theory of social psychology. And while Kurt Levine has been lost in the history books, we have not ignored Leon Festinger and cognitive dissonance. So let me move my camera a little bit here for you. But cognitive dissonance theory is where the self in social psychology really becomes super, super important. And this theory is the late 50s. So it's been important for a very long time. Now, essentially, the experiment works this way. You have two groups. They both do this horrible task for an hour. Turn these blocks a quarter turn. Has I think it's one block every 5 seconds for an hour. Could you imagine how horrible that was? Even me, I'm going so fast right now compared to how they were going. Right? It's just horrible. The most boring task ever invented. So, yeah, two groups do that. And then one group was paid $1, one group was paid $20. You're like, wait, what were they paid $1 for? What were they paid $20 for? And this is 1950s money, so it's about, $10 bucks in the $1 condition, and the $20 condition is $150, in purchasing power now. And they were paid this money to lie to the next group of participants. They were paid $1 to lie to people and tell them that this task that is horrible was fun. Okay? And then they were asked personally, how much they actually thought the task was fun. And what they found was that those who were paid $1 said they liked the task more than those that were paid $20. Now, you might be like, hey, I like tasks that I get paid more money for. This doesn't make sense to me. Yeah, exactly. That's the point. Now, let's go through the reasoning here. When you are lying to somebody and tricking them, that doesn't feel good. You're not a good person, right? So if I can buy your lying for $10 versus $150 in modern money, $1 in 1957, $20 in 1957, what's that say about you? It says you don't have that ethics, you don't have morals, you're not a good person, you don't have character, right? You're not okay with that. So how do you deal with that stress and that strain of these horrible ideas? You actually convince yourself that you enjoyed the task. Now, but if I pay $150 to tell some students that this research experiment is fun, you're like, look, yeah, I lied to you, but $150, you can buy my moral, you can buy my word for $150. Most college students would agree. This isn't something totally horrible. It's you're helping out science. There's a bunch of good things to it. Now you're seeing cognitive dissonance in action too. It's oh, yeah, this isn't that bad. Yeah, I lied to you. I don't really like it. Yeah, it's a good thing though. You need to do it. We need to help science out, right? You can see where I'm coming from. This is cognitive dissonance. This is where the self in psychology comes from. So cognitive dissonance theory should really be called cognitive consonance theory. Humans want a stable sense of self. We want our actions, thoughts, and behaviors to match. We don't like hypocrisy. We get really frustrated when somebody points out our hypocrisy. And when the hypocrisy is pointed out to us, we experience a negative emotional state called cognitive dissonance. And this negative emotional state leads us to potential to change attitudes, behaviors, and so forth. So cognitive dissonance is so important to the field of psychology because if we want to change people's opinions, one of the ways to get there is to use dissonance. Essentially, you have pressure and a desire to make sense of yourself, to have a stable conception of who you are. And when this perception is violated, you experience some pain. Ultimately, this is when I would say the self and social psychology started. We never got rid of the self after this point, but we process the social world through us. So understanding how we operate, how we make demands of ourselves to be consistent, how we respond when these demands aren't met is core social psychology. But we as humans strive to be a human being that is logical, that makes sense, that is consistent, that has meaning and purpose. All right.